Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nassim Ahmed. I will be your host for today's conversation, which will be on the latest edition of the European Islamophobia report covering the year 2020. I am joined by the report's editor, Farid Hafez. Farid is a visiting professor of international studies at Williams College and a non-resident senior researcher at Georgetown University's The Bridge Initiative at the School of Foreign Service. Since 2010, he has been the editor of Islamophobia Studies Yearbook, and over the past 6 years, he has been the co-editor of the European Islamophobia report. Thank you for joining us, Farid. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
First of all, congratulations on the successful publication of this year's report. It's an enormous piece of work, I should say. It's around some 900 pages long. So I'm going to give you the very tough task of just broadly giving us the brief genesis of this year's annual report, and also tell our readers what they can expect to find in it.
All right. Well, first of all, I always have to thank all the others who have been participating in that project, because at the end of the day, this is a collective work of more than 30 scholars and activists, NGO activists, who are involved in writing the respective country reports. We cover more than 30 countries, and this is what we've been doing for the last 6 years now. So I'm always very grateful that there is such an amount of critical people who are willing also to do this kind of work. Who are concerned regarding the development and the expansion of Islamophobia in their respective countries, but more generally throughout Europe. So what can you expect if you want to read this report? What we do is basically we try to give an idea of what happened, and it's really very much like kind of a collection of everything that happened between January 1st and December 31st in each year. Maybe to say something about the reason why we even have established this kind of report. I remember back then in 2014 when we started this, there was a lot of talk on the side of anti-racist organizations, but also Muslim NGOs, that Islamophobia is a problem. But, whenever people went to the state authorities or even to other people as potential allies in civil society, there was always this feeling like, okay, where are the facts? So this is what we wanted to provide. And this is really what the European Islamophobia report is all about. It's about providing the facts that you cannot anymore deny the existence. Obviously, when you speak to Muslim folks out there, everybody can tell you hundreds of stories of things that they have lived through, right? But as long as this is not written, it's like it doesn't exist. So this was basically the main idea why we even came up with that. And I think we did a good job. I think all of the people who have been participating, more than 100 authors meanwhile, have done a great job in providing this and making it clear and not deniable anymore. Islamophobia is here. Islamophobia is a problem. So what we want then, and this is kind of also how every single report ends, is a list of recommendations for civil society and policymakers that people think about how to overcome, think about how to move against these forms of exclusion.
You spoke about resistance to Islamophobia from certain sections of society. How strong is that resistance at the moment? For you and I, we know Islamophobia exists. There's people out there who are in complete denial. Growing up in the West myself, I can clearly distinguish between, say, for example, racism I suffered when I was young to the Islamophobia you suffer now. There's a clear distinction. A lot of the distractors will say, no, there's no such thing as Islamophobia. It's racism against Muslims, racism against Black people, Asian people, yes. But people like me, I can clearly see the difference when I'm being called something when I was in my teens to when people are experiencing real life Islamophobia. Why have they been unwilling and refusing to accept that there has been a shift in the way Muslims experience racism in the West right now. There's been such a resistance to that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to disentangle this, I mean, maybe to speak about two different things here. On one hand, there is this denial, and I think there will always be this denial, because merely accepting the existence is a problem, because it needs then a solution. It needs people to act upon it. So obviously, those who are deeply Islamophobic, they are not interested in any form of overcoming that, okay? So that's for sure. But also, we should not forget that there are those who may want to help, but they have to argue for that. So providing them with information, with a report like that, is of help, right? Because it allows them to make a case. There is a problem, we have to do something about it. Then obviously, I mean, in terms of racism and Islamophobia, maybe also to make this clear here, we have a working definition that we propose, which is very much related actually, and using Islamophobia synonymously with anti-Muslim racism. What we are concerned about, and the way also maybe just to give you a brief idea, our idea of what Islamophobia is that we say Islamophobia is about a dominant group of people aiming at seizing, stabilizing, and widening their power by means of defining a scapegoat, in this case, the Muslim, in order to exclude these Muslim people who are an imagined community from the resources, from the rights, and from the definition of who we are as a society within a nation state. So this is our understanding of Islamophobia. So it's very much related to the dimension of power, and very much related to also understanding Islamophobia not only as anti-Muslim hate crime, like the discrimination that is happening on a daily basis on the streets, but rather also as a structural problem that is very much tied to power structures. Therefore, if you look into our report, we give an idea of what happened in the labor market, what happened in the justice system, what happened in politics, what happened in media, what happened in the internet, and so on and so forth. So it's trying to give a very comprehensive idea of how Islamophobia materializes. So coming back to this question, if we understand Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism, then obviously the problem is not so much with the Muslims. The problem is very much with the power circles, right? And this is what we're tackling. And obviously that's going to be a tough thing, right? Because who wants to listen? Who wants to give a piece of his power and share it with somebody else? But I think that's the ultimate question at the end of the day. Why? Because in a longer perspective, and this is especially true, I think, for the Western part of Europe, on a longer perspective, Muslims are a large portion of the society. And the question is ultimately, which place do they have, right?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a lot of issues there, and your report, of course, goes into great length in exploring not just the definition, but the real life experience of Muslims and the impact it's having on Europe's Muslim citizens. I wonder if I can begin really with your own personal experience. Some would say your own experience is typical of why, a report like this is so important. The raid on your home, of course, did not come out of the blue. But before we get to that, can you give us a background to the November 2020 incident when the Austrian police raided your house as part of a wider crackdown on Muslim activists? It's for our listeners just to get a sense of how it's having a real life impact on academic, a scholar like yourself, who is an upstanding citizen but gets caught up in this dragnet of state suppression. How did that happen?
Well, I mean, there is a lot to say about that. And it's not something that I would be able to do within 5 minutes. But to I mean, for connecting it, you know, this whole story with my work on Islamophobia, just to give you a glimpse of an idea of why that is happening. Obviously, I mean, the raid, you know, on November 2nd, there was a militant attack in downtown Vienna, which was perpetrated by a former sympathist of ISIS. The perpetrator was killed on November 2nd, so we don't really have much more details other than what he used to be aligned with, at least ideologically speaking. 1 week later, a raid happened that had about 70 victims, individuals as well as institutions, all Muslim, but which was unrelated to this attack, legally speaking. And also the politicians said, well, there is no relationship. But nevertheless, the whole atmosphere was like, you know, what is the government now going to do after the first time in Austrian history in the last 20 years, such an attack happened by an alleged Islamist. So the idea was then, okay, you know, the government wanted to show we tough on them. So that's, I think this is kind of the context in which we have to understand also when that happened and how it was politicized in a way. Let me just get back the light. Yeah. So obviously one of the things at stake here, I think in terms of my person, was my work on Islamophobia. And I'll just give you one example of what you can find in the files in the investigation against my person. So one of the things that they would say was, and that's a literal quote of the investigation by the Austrian Secret Service, how they framed any kind of, I would say, opposition to the government. So they said, they allegedly argued that they had found a strategy paper for the establishment of what they call a parallel society, which is kind of what the Muslim ghetto is in the Anglo-Saxon world. And they said, in the strategy papers for the establishment of a parallel state or caliphate, it is defined that a public discourse must take place by means of the term Islamophobia. So in other words, this is quote unquote. In other words, what they're saying is whoever speaks about Islamophobia wants to create a caliphate. Okay? So then they raided the houses of so many people, including myself, because they were arguing, like legally speaking, it's because of terrorism. So you accused, suspect of a terrorist organization, right? And they, you know, with all the implications it had, 5 o'clock in the morning, raiding the house, waking up the kids with heavy weapons, bank account and assets frozen. You know, then when the media starts speaking about this, it's like your reputation is completely destroyed, and so on and so forth. So obviously, this, I think, even more important, the signal that had on the wider Muslim community and also on the wider Austrian society was very much a wave of intimidation that the people felt, especially because we were denied access to the files. That's why we did not even know what the heck is going on here. Mm. So it was like, maybe there is something, you know, they want to create a connection between you and the guy who did that. You know, nobody knew at that moment. And for the first 3-4 months when we had no access to the files. So that was a tough time. And it shows you like how difficult it might be doing the work that I'm doing. And I feel also, not only myself, but also if I look to other authors in other European countries who did the European Islamophobia report on their country, you know, people were criticized by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Interior. It's not a small thing, right? If you get become the whole public attention is drawn on you because you criticize your government for doing some Islamophobic stuff, and then you become a public enemy. And I feel and I see that more and more authors that we have might be natives of their countries they do reports on, but they are actually living outside of the country, because this is making it easier for them. And, you know, coming to such a point where
is that the case with you? Is that why you're in the US though?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I consider myself in a way living in a form of exile. So there is no much environment for me really to do that kind of work, and, you know, not having to fear that the police storms your house at 5 o'clock in the morning, destroys your door, and intimidates your children, your small children, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is not a way you want to live your life, right? So yes, I think that also shows us how difficult it has become in certain countries. By no means I'm saying that this is all the case in all over Europe, but there are certain countries like Austria, like France, like Denmark, which are very, very hawkish in their, not only in their Islam policies, but also in the way how they treat critical scholarship and people who speak out against these injustices that they are witnessing.
For those who aren't following the rise of Islamophobia in Europe, I think what you're saying, just that segment, would be quite chilling, that this so-called liberal democratic country is so quickly turned as authoritarian as it did, you know, cracking down on your home without really any evidence. I was wondering whether you can see, of course, it didn't come out of the blue, you know, there's certain context, political, social context, which has given rise to this level of crackdown authoritarianism in many of these countries, Austria and France in particular. What do you see is the common thread connecting, you know, Islamophobia, the raid in your house, what's happening in France, you mentioned Denmark, and elsewhere in Europe? What are the key threads that unite Islamophobia in the 32 countries that your report covers?
Well, I would not say that there are like some key features that you can see all over the places. I think the contexts are just too different. I mean, even when I speak about, you know, my own case, which I've gone through, and the Austrian situation, Austria is very different, alongside maybe France and Denmark, who are kind of having this kind of alliance also in trying to criminalize Muslim civil society as well as critical scholarship on these issues, compared, let's say, maybe to other countries like Spain and Portugal, or other countries in the east of the European Union. So the experiences are different. I think also in terms of, like, even if you look into those countries, you know, like Austria, you don't find a lot of solidarity that if you become a victim of such a crackdown. But in other countries, there are much stronger anti-racist organizations. In some countries, you have Muslims are part of the political system, right? They are in different political parties. They have something to say. They represent. Rather, in other countries, where still the majority of politicians is like very white, and those Muslims who are allowed an entrance into the sphere of life are like only the super assimilated, you know, it's like there is very little space also to contest these policies. So I would not speak of general trends throughout Europe, but this is what we're doing. Like every year, we're trying to find in a way make aware of certain developments that are very, very troubling. And that is for that year was what happened in France for 2020. And in other years, it was like more putting an emphasis on what happened in terms of militant underground far-right parties and movements who are very much drawing on Islamophobia and committing violence against people, killing people.
And where are we seeing the biggest rise in that? Because it's one of the things I was going to ask you about, the rise of militant Islamophobia. Where are we seeing, which European states are we seeing this rising the most?
I mean, one of the interesting things is obviously that not every nation state and not every media within the nation state really talks about these issues very extensively, and a lot of our authors are also rely on media reports to some extent. But there have been cases in France, there have been cases in Germany, there have been cases in Sweden, there have been cases in Austria. Where you find far-right movements in the underground that prepare for what they call the Day X. Day X stands for the time when they're gonna have a putsch, when they're gonna putsch the political system and try to create an authoritarian state that is governed by themselves. And what we can see is that, and I think, certain countries realize that this is really a threat even to their power, much more than the imagined threat of Muslims is, right? So when their politicians, for instance, get killed, like it happened with Walter Lübcke, a famous German grand politician of the Christian Democratic Union, he was killed in his private home by a sniper, right? Why? Because he was a very pro-immigrant, had a very pro-immigrant stances when it came to the influx of refugees from Syria and Iraq back in 2015. So the moment, somebody who is part of your political system is threatened to such an extent, he loses his life, he is killed in his own balcony. That shows you, I mean, that is the moment when people understand, Islamophobia is not only a threat to the Muslim community, it's a threat to us. And I think that's the moment, when they realize we have to do something about it. And that is, I think, also one of the reasons why we see, for instance, in countries like Germany, a lot of attempts also to go against this. I mean, Germany, at the end of the day, they established an expert round by the Ministry of Interior to fight what they call anti-Muslimness, right? Mm. So that is something. I mean, still you have the other side and other state authorities doing quite the opposite, but it is this kind of tension that is created by these incidents.
Yeah, I mean, talking about threats, I think the turn France has taken in Austria is probably a threat to what we would say is healthy liberal democracies. They are authoritarian liberals in some sense, which is how many people choose to describe them. On the issue of far-right violent extremism and their rise, I mean, instead of that, you chose to put Macron on the front cover of your report this year, rather than, say, for example, a far-right extremist who wants to, throw Muslims out violently from Europe. What does that say about the shape of Islamophobia in Europe now? Macron is a centrist, some would say progressive, liberal. What does that say about where Islamophobia is heading in this current year, at least?
Well, first of all, definitely an important aspect. And I mean, we wanted to make aware of this problem of institutionalized Islamophobia by the governments, not by the far right. I mean, we always have to keep in mind, no matter how bad the far right is, at the end of the day, in most countries, it is at the margin of the political system. They are mostly in opposition. And if they come to power, they only stay for 2 years because they just don't have the human resources to really run a country. I mean, that has always been the experience in most Western European countries where the far right has been part of a coalition government. So the problems that we're seeing that Muslims are facing are not so much only from these far-right groups. I mean, the problem that the far-right groups are creating is obviously that they are shaping the public discourse. So they are putting in a way a discursive pressure on the rest of the political parties. So they either have to stand on the side of the Muslims and defend them and stand against Islamophobia, or they starting to co-opt these claims. And this is what we're witnessing in many countries, especially from the centrist right or the liberal political parties, but also in some cases from the Social Democrats, right? But I would argue more the centrist right is those who are really co-opting these policy claims, though they are twisting a little bit the way how they frame their arguments. I mean, less blatantly racist and more like, you know, we want to protect the Muslims. That why are we doing these and those measures, and that's why we're implementing them. But coming back to the initial question, Macron and why Macron. Very similar to what I just talked about for the Austrian case, when the murder of Samuel Paty, the French history teacher, happened. Macron used this as an excuse to crack down massively on the Muslim civil society. They raided numerous mosques. Meanwhile, they also closed a lot of them. They closed also anti-racist organizations like one of the most well-known ones, CCIF, the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, alongside other humanitarian and other organizations. And that all of these measures went along other authoritarian movements, like, for instance, when the Minister of Education said, as well as Macron himself, argued that one of the problems in France would be the import of dangerous knowledge from the United States, which is post-colonial studies, gender studies, racism studies, and critical race theory. So he basically criticized French scholars and intellectuals who would use these methods and theories in order to criticize the French government, saying this is a dangerous knowledge that, according to him, divides the French society. And again, I think that is very, very much what I just read about the files when the Austrian state authorities speak about Islamophobia, right? It's like you create the caliphate when you speak about Islamophobia. So it's, you know, these measures, you know, going against freedom of speech, going against freedom of knowledge production, going against freedom of association, going against freedom of religion. This is what authoritarianism is all about, right? And in that way, I think Macron really earned it, because the way he implemented all of these measures, I mean, that is outstanding. And I think the problem that we are also witnessing, I remember I was interviewed to what happened in France. And, you know, when I criticized it, a lot of journalists in Europe, they would say like, but, you know, there must be a reason why they're closing these mosques down. If there is a terrorism allegation going on, there is a reason. That was even before that happened to me. And I said, you know, no, because that is not the way you do it. And the problem with, just and I'll end here. The problem is that the general image Macron has is like, he's a liberal guy. And, you know, calling his Islamophobia out, I think, is crucial for us to create a critical awareness in the European public space that we have to look very critically about what is going on here.
And do you think that this is where the biggest risk lies, state-sanctioned Islamophobia? And do you see that as a reality in the UK as well, where recently, I mean, do you connect the two, where recently, for example, the government passed legislation where they can withdraw citizenship without notification of the notification? Do you see any connection in that? Do you see, you know, France and Austria being the template for what UK will do, what many of the other more liberal countries, or countries that haven't taken the authoritarian turn as France and Austria has? Do you think they see Austria, France as a template? This is what we want to be replicating in our countries.
I think France and Austria and Denmark see themselves as a template that should be copied by the other countries. And this is also what we have seen after these two militant attacks in Vienna and Paris. What happened was there was this incident when ministers of interior of the European Union issued a statement. And this draft came from Germany, Austria, and France, and included several mentions of Islam, which at the final draft, because of all the other EU countries that pushed against it, the final draft only included one mention of Islam. But that shows us still also that, the dynamics that are going on within the European, it's not that France and Austria rule the game, but they're obviously very much interested. And that is also what we saw at the end of October. There was this forum against radicalization that happened in Austria. And again, who was participating? Denmark, France, and some politicians from Flanders in Belgium. So what we see is, yes, they have this agenda that they want to become the leaders in this effort. At the very same time, I do hope that the UK stands outside of these dynamics. And, also one of the things that is quite interesting to see, our European Islamophobia report, we presented it several times within the in the European Parliament. And it was always, except of the first time, on behalf of an invitation that came from UK politicians, MEPs, members of the European Parliament, that were not only from the Greens or the Socialists, the Labour Party, but also from the Conservatives. Pardon me. So it was also from the Conservatives, which shows you, I think, that really the point of departure where you discuss these issues in the UK is very different to what you find in continental Europe. So I would argue, while there are obviously lots of problems also going on in the UK, and you know that much more than I do in detail. And I think those state legislations, taking the citizenship from people, very much tied to terrorism laws, etc., that is very problematic, and that I would see that as a very problematic trend within, this authoritarian development. But I would also argue that the UK is much better off than a lot of other continental European countries, not at least because Muslims just play a much better and more important role in the public sphere. You do have MPs on certain levels of municipalities, national level, etc. If you compare that with countries like Germany or France, it's not comparable.
Yeah. I think you touched upon the fact that UK is in a much better place, and I think we're also seeing in the US, at least on the Democrat side, a recognition that Islamophobia is a concern, and they've passed a law recently, which has passed Congress, but not Senate at the moment, but at least House of Representatives, where they voted to set up a office monitoring Islamophobia around the world, which is a positive sign. Would you not say?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think the United States in many ways is very different. So yes, first of all, I mean, this legislation came inter alia from Ilhan Omar, but not only from her as a Muslim, also from other Congress people who supported this legislation. And no matter what happens to that legislation, because that legislation would especially be part of the State Department's Office for Interreligious Freedom. And if you look, for instance, into the reports on interreligious freedom by the US State Department on France, you will see that they talk about these issues critically. So that shows you again that they have their eyes on these developments, and they see it not as something that should be taken as an example. It is a problem for them of religious freedom. That's by definition being part of these reports. Also, the raid that happened in Austria, by the way, was mentioned in the Interreligious Freedom Report on Austria by the US State Department. So yes, I think these are good signs, though I think there is an international relations aspect, obviously, to this act, because the United States are preoccupied with what is going on in Xinjiang and using this also against China. So there is it is part and parcel of a grand strategy of international politics to some extent. But nevertheless, while in Europe, we're still thinking about, should we recognize Islamophobia as a term? You have these policies going on in the United States. It shows you how much apart these countries are from each other. At the very same time, we have the coordinator on anti-Muslim hate crime in Europe by the European Union, and this position has not been filled since half a year and has been vacant. So that also shows you the few emphasis the current European Commission puts on these issues. And again, that's only one example of several ones that show you that these issues are not taken seriously. At the very same time, let's say, for instance, the Fundamental Rights Agency or the European Union has just issued a report where they especially problematized that all the anti-terrorism legislation is especially a threat to the Muslim community within Europe. This is something that you see that certain bodies do problematize these policies that are in place, while that there are also other forces coming, especially from countries like France, who try to suppress all of this critical knowledge that is produced and try to just continue their policies. I mean, even what happened with the raid, the Austrian political elite is still like, yeah, that was a good thing, and we're not gonna go one step back here. Although the court has ruled that this raid was unlawful. And also, in the meantime, a lot of people have spoken out against it.
One final question. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here, and we ended up in the US, and I was wondering whether I could stay there and ask you about a report that was published by CARE, the American Council on American Islamic Relations. They also published a report on Islamophobia within the US and the funding that goes into the Islamophobia network. And they found that 106 million was poured into some 26 different organizations pushing, peddling Islamophobia in media and various parts of society. Just a final question. I mean, do you see something similar in the European context where there are millions and millions of pounds being, through charitable organizations, through donations, which is being pumped into a network of hate against Muslim across Europe?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, there is a concerted effort on behalf of different international players who are very much interested in disenfranchising Muslim rights and stabilizing their own position of power in their own countries, who are very much, I mean, it's interesting, because I remember one of my first pieces that I wrote back in 2017 on those think tanks. I spoke about the European Foundation for Democracy, that is a Brussels-based think tank, very much connected also to financiers coming from the United States. And one of their major projects was basically criminalizing Muslim civil society by creating a link between native Muslim organizations and the Muslim Brotherhood. And this Muslim Brotherhood allegation is kind of like, because nobody really knows what the Muslim Brotherhood is all about, and it sounds kind of dangerous, and that's why we make these kinds of create these affiliations. And that has been one strong attempt by these scholars who were affiliated with that think tank. We see that also in a lot of think tanks that are based in the east of Europe, especially in the Balkans, where people try to diminish the role Muslims have played and are playing within those countries. So obviously there are a lot of different groups who are interested out of different reasons to mingle into this issue and to have a say and to support these anti-Muslim sentiments. And especially, I would argue, to create knowledge in order to criminalize those Muslims who are active on the scene. And that's not necessarily always like, Muslims who care about their religion. It's also very much about the politics some even cultural Muslims, so to say, pursue by having an agency and speaking on behalf either of disenfranchised Muslim community within their domestic sphere, or also speaking on international issues like the Palestine issue. So there is a wide range, I think, of actors who become a threat to those interests who are pouring that kind of money into these programs and think tanks and so on and so forth.
No, it's fantastic, Farid. I mean, we've spoken much longer than we normally do. Our program's half an hour, but it shows how much ground we've covered and how interesting our conversation has been. I want to thank you for joining us today. I highly recommend the report. I mean, as I said, it is quite long, but choose the country you want to read. We'll share the link on Memo website. I recommend our readers to, download it and have a look and choose the country you want. You may not want to read 900 pages worth, of course, but I found it very, very interesting, at least the executive summary and the countries of my choice, which was in this case Austria and France and the UK. By any case, I want to thank Farid and thank our viewers at home, and we'll join you again soon. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.